Hello and welcome to Compounding Curiosity. I'm your host Kalani Scarrett, and this podcast is all about compounding your curiosity alongside my own through thoughtful interviews with interesting guests. For transcripts and detailed show notes, check out the links in the description. Hopefully you're as keen as me to learn something new, so let's get stuck in. My guest today is Jordan Schneider. Jordan is a China tech analyst at the Rhodium group, as well as the host of the extremely popular ChinaTalk podcast and newsletter. In this conversation, we cover common prosperity, Xi Jinping's goals, and how this all ties in with ASEAN and the rest of the world. So I hope you enjoy my conversation with Jordan Schneider. So the education crackdown, what's the go, and what do you think the end goal is maybe?
Sure. So I think before we get to the education sector in particular, it's important to look at what's kind of going on more broadly in China from a demographic as well as a governing private sector governance perspective. So we've had a really, really dramatic few months, starting with the Ant Financial IPO zapping, and moving now through 2021 with all of these anti-monopoly rulings, the Didi actions, and as you mentioned, the education, and then just 2 days ago, this whole gaming crackdown. So, what is Beijing's real motivation here underlying all these policy moves? So yes, it is about party control. There have been a lot of kind of power centers, or just not even power centers, but just ways in which the Chinese people are influenced through the private sector, which the Chinese government does not have as close a grasp on as they would like to. And kind of trends are developing, which are impacting people's lives, which the Chinese government either isn't happy with, or people in general aren't happy with, that the Chinese government wants to kind of address. So the sort of overall response to middle-class consumer frustration over various social and tech ailments is something that you can see as a bit of a thread connecting what's going on with data privacy, with the gig economy workers, dealing with Meituan and Didi, and as you mentioned, the education crackdown. So at the end of the day, the CCP's goal is to, keep society stable and growing and kind of increase China's power and glory, for lack of a better word. What is very important to do that is keeping middle class city dwellers happy, because that's where the revolution starts. If there is ever going to be any movement against CCP rule, it's going to start from that sort of band of society. So addressing their sort of concerns and needs is, has really been front and center for the party, ever since Tiananmen, where it was very clear that there, is a sort of a latent potential threat that can come from city-driven revolutions. Also, we have this broader push towards reorienting the sort of driving economic energy of the Chinese economy away from consumer and towards science and hard tech firms. And what that means is sort of reorienting talent, private capital, and the government backing, which, gives tax credits and free land and whatnot to firms, away from what has really been the growth story for mainland China for the past few decades and into something new. Now, why? The Chinese government is kind of right in that the consumer story is to a certain extent played out. Their, urbanization, which was driving a lot of this, is slowing down. The demographics are a serious issue, which China is going to be facing over the next, over the coming decades. So in order to kind of keep productivity growing, China needs to be able to compete in sectors beyond the ones in which it is currently competitive. And, that is where you see all of this, emphasis by the Chinese government on semiconductors, on EVs, on solar, on biotech, these sort of new growth industries, which they're hoping are going to be able to bring, waves of growth and employment that are large enough to, keep China on a growth trajectory to address its debt bubble and, continue its climb up the global value chain. And if everyone is kind of going into, if the capital and talent is going into sectors which don't necessarily have that growth trajectory in their future, that's not ideal from Beijing's perspective.
So do you think this all ties in with the common prosperity goal they're going for?
So the common prosperity goal is a really interesting one. And I think, so, just for some context, it is a communist party, right? So there is and in the Mao era, it was one of the most equal societies in the world, but equal by everyone being poor. And in the past few decades, there's been a dramatic increase in the Gini coefficient measuring, the distribution of wealth in society. And so when you think about like addressing middle class angst, seeing outrageously rich people kind of drive, society is not something that, is something that has turned. I mean, you had Deng in the 80s, it's to say, saying to get rich is glorious. And, China was able in a somewhat miraculous way to release the kind of potential energy of decades and decades of mismanagement into an incredibly sort of dynamic capitalist society. However, there are downsides to that. And there's also a real chance of the CCP overshooting the mark on this one, in which you sort of take enough out of the private sector, which is better at allocating capital and driving productivity growth than the state sector, and putting them in sort of too many boxes where the capital and energy ends up not going to where it can drive the greatest sort of return. So it's a dangerous game that Beijing is playing, and it is certainly at risk of overshooting. CCP campaigns are very good at orienting the bureaucracy directionally, but aren't quite as strong at doing it, at sort of gauging how far to go. Because sort of once you let loose the dogs from a regulatory, from a Chinese regulatory perspective, everyone keeps running in that direction. And often over the 75 plus years of CCP rule, you've seen that regulation often overshoots the mark of what's optimal from a societal perspective. So this new push towards getting sort of the rich to contribute and not necessarily having the country be dominated by the 0.01% is something that echoes a lot of the rhetoric which you see around the world, right? It's like a relatively, there's a way to look at it as kind of like a boring social democrat take on the way society is run. But when you put that in the hands of a party which, has far more levers at their disposal than, a democratic one in the 21st century, there is a real risk of overshooting in a way that could be potentially dangerous to China's future economic growth.
Is that probably the main challenge you think she faces when it's trying to overcome for common prosperity? Is there any other risks, do you think?
I mean, I think the biggest risk is China is still really, really poor. They still have hundreds of millions of people who make, $100 a day. And so I think sort of for the broader, development of Chinese society, rural poverty needs to be addressed. And that is an enormous problem. China within it contains Zimbabwe levels of development. It contains Argentina levels of development, and it contains Singapore levels of development. And, common prosperity, the extent to which it refocuses policy on the sort of left behind and the, undereducated, I think is a sort of positive thing for the long-term macroeconomic health of China. But, if all it does is push rich people to donate $50 million to a charity or something, as opposed to driving a real change and a renewed focus on the real development laggards, then it's not going to have the sort of effect that I guess I would like as someone who would like to see more people out of poverty. From Xi's perspective, I think his incentives are a little different, right? He's trying to sort of keep the boat afloat and, signal to folks that, the CCP is doing a good job and is organizing society in a way which most people agree with. And I think from his perspective, his first big push, which is roughly analogous to what seems to be happening today, was this anti-corruption action in the first few years of his of his rule. And by and large, I think that came out quite well for him, both in being able to, clear out opposition from the party, as well as, to a large extent, clean up a lot of sort of dirty dealing, which had really gotten out of hand by the early 2010s. And, this is a different ball game in that he is trying to, potentially radically increase the amount of control and direction that the party gives to the private sector. And it's much more, the sort of like the kind of downside of the anti-corruption action is that party members became much more sort of like entrepreneurial in taking steps because they were worried that they would be whacked for getting out of line. When that happens in the private sector, growth slows, and that can potentially rebound back pretty poorly on Chinese society as a whole. So I think that's the kind of dynamic to watch is, to what extent these sorts of reforms really end up harming the sort of like efficient allocation of talent and capital, which China needs if it wants to keep growing.
Yeah, that's great. And I think this could obviously be a big stretch, but is there any parallels, do you think, that can be drawn from the Great Leap Forward or the Cultural Revolution that maybe non-historians should be familiar with?
Ooh, I mean, I don't want to go that far. Like, Great Leap Forward, 50 million people died. Cultural Revolution, 5 million people died. I think it's important to understand those periods in history in that I think, when I'm talking about sort of Chinese, like the CCP overshooting, that is definitely something that happened in those two things. And there's a potential for, both of those times, there were real moments in which Mao was not in control. And, he was trying to sort of tamp things down, but it got kind of too crazy. And China is a very large country. And, even nowadays when you have, video conferencing and whatever, like the size of the bureaucracy means such that it's going to be really difficult for Beijing to tune it in such a way where it doesn't overdo it. So, like if it's a sort of soak the rich thing, the way you could see it potentially playing out is every province is like, okay, we got to do this like soak the rich thing. And, what happened in the not the Great Leap Forward, but for land reform, the sort of first major political action that the CCP did once it got in power is, you had people who had like one cow because they had a cow, as opposed to everyone else in the village that had chickens, like lives get completely destroyed. I'm not saying that like that is the way in which common prosperity is going to end up, circa March 2022, but that sort of dynamic of everyone sort of working towards the direction that Beijing sets, especially when it's something like common prosperity, where there's a way in where you really are playing with fire, and it's a pretty straight. It doesn't take too many leaps to see how like just like squeezing every rich person in China, regardless of sort of where they are on the socioeconomic ladder, if it's only relative, ends up like really hurting the economic dynamism of a country is a dangerous thing. And yeah, I mean, I would really recommend folks to check out China Under Mao, A Revolution Derailed by Andrew Walder. If they're curious in getting sort of a relatively brief, like 350-page intro snapshot to that point in history, because I do think it's important. And there are, if not in degree, certainly in kind, when you look at sort of Chinese governance and CCP governance problems in particular over the past few decades. Though I think sort of like the sort of one-to-one comparisons are a little overdone, because first and foremost, thankfully, no one is dying.
Yeah, so that ties in perfectly for the next one. Is there anything that really annoys you when outsiders express their opinion on the CCP and the like? Like, is there any opinions that you think are just totally misguided, or what really grinds your gears, I guess?
Like there is this sort of latent thing in the US where sort of anti-China anti-CCP gets very quickly conflated with anti-China. Like recently I was on a call with someone and they were like, if we don't handle this right, our grandkids might be speaking Chinese one day. And I was like, honestly, like, I think they should be speaking Chinese. Chinese is a great language. Like, I speak Chinese. I'm really happy I do. So that sort of thing, I think, is a lot more common than it was, 5 years ago before people were freaking out about this. And it's really unfortunate. And, more than sort of like right-wing folks comparing woke culture to the Cultural Revolution, I think is more insidious because it's outrageous to write off 1 billion people. And the more that happens in sort of policymaking communities, the more stupid you get when you try to write those sorts of policies to respond to contemporary China.
Yeah, so like imagine you're president of the US. How do you think that the US should approach China, maybe, and more specifically the CCP, do you think? What would you go about?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have a bumper sticker, to be honest. I think like I'm going to sort of take the Biden line in which like at the end of the day, there are two things which really matter. First is like America being functional. And second is the strength of its allies and its sort of network of allies. So first off, if like, even if China eclipses the US from a like size perspective, if America is still sort of the world's most dynamic, technologically advanced economy, like that bodes well going forward. And if China sort of remains a bit of an island diplomatically, and the U.S. can still call on, the likes of Australia and Korea and Taiwan and Japan and the EU to sort of like do stuff with them when the going gets tough, then that sort of matters a lot more than the sort of one-to-one U.S.-China comparison. So I think, that was probably the worst, like I mean, Trump was really bad, but one of the sort of most dangerous long-term impacts that he had was telling all the allies to go fuck themselves. And that is really unfortunate because you don't earn that trust back ever. I don't know, maybe like a decade or two of having normal governance in the U.S., which is really sort of scary and unfortunate because those are the two real pillars of America, like making sure that like it still is able to, do its thing and like influence the world in a nice way, which is like kind of a really weird thing to say 2 weeks after like leaving Afghanistan to the dogs. Yeah, that would be my sort of two lodestars going forward.
Yeah, some great points. To come back to Xi Jinping and maybe compare him to his predecessors, Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, is there any, like particularly in terms of China's role in the world, how do you think they differ? Maybe is Xi more aggressive, do you reckon? Or is it, you mentioned before, just trying to not rock the boat. Is it just more of a case of that, do you think?
Yeah, I think Xi is a lot more confident. And I think he has the right to be in that, China's growth story is a really incredible one. And a lot of people were betting on it ending, and it hasn't. And, there have been a handful of Chinese firms which have made it to the technological frontier, which is also an open question up until, 2013, 2014. Whether China can innovate, whether Chinese firms are really creative. And, that sort of enables the swagger, which he has now carried to a degree which I think is counterproductive, but is one that is, to a certain extent, justified. It's not like it's not like a bantamweight, like walking into a heavyweight bout at this point. The thinking about like how past Chinese leaders have conceptualized their relationship to the world. Mao thought he was the, head of a global revolution and wanted to be perceived as such, and was like more aggressive wanted to be like more hardcore than Khrushchev because he wanted to, be supporting like the most badass rebels and making sure that like he's causing the most mischief around the world. After Mao, Deng thought that was ridiculous, and justifiably so, given that China was like one of the poorest countries on the planet. And, there has been and sort of over the subsequent decades, like China's kind of chilled out diplomatically and, really focused on domestic economic reform. Xi is not Mao. He does not want to create world revolution, thankfully. However, at the same time, he does have an aggressive nationalist vision of China's place in the world and the sort of like respect that it should engender in its relations abroad. And that also kind of coupled with a very sort of facile view of diplomatic relationship building. I don't think that she necessarily has internalized the power and the what it took to build the alliance network that the U.S. has created, and how it's kind of like a few world wars and a lot like a shared democratic tradition, which all builds that up. And I think the kind of like one of the corollaries of the Belt and Road Initiative was that like doing all this development would end up creating true allies for the Chinese, which regardless of what you think about the economic implications of the Belt and Road, it certainly has not done much besides maybe like winning one or two like random votes in the General Assembly for things that like do not like really matter in the long run. And I think he also, sees the sort of wolf warrior dumb of the way she sees the world is also a domestic game, in as much as probably more a domestic game than it is an international game, in that, part of showing that like China's made it and that like the CCP is legitimate and deserves to rule the country is to show that like it won't be messed around with, and like it can stand up strong to the sort of like bullying which China has been subject to ever since 1840 and the Opium Wars or what have you, and that leads to this like loud for international ears like obnoxious aggressive stuff happening with fighting with Australia over exports and in the border with India. The one thing I will say is that like I think the sort of two most counterproductive things that Xi has done from his international standing are the sort of crackdown and takeover of Hong Kong and the treatment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and both of those are entirely driven by domestic political logic without taking into account what the rest of the world thinks about what's going on and what China considers to be its internal affairs. But at the end of the day, like those two developments are really dramatic and shape the way a lot of folks view China now and will view China for the duration, at least the duration of Xi's rule. And that's not something that can be undone with building bridges. I mean, literal dams and bridges around the world.
So going forward, I know how do you feel with Xi in power? Like, what are you positive about? Obviously there's a few common negatives and well known, but how are you feeling towards it, do you reckon, maybe?
It's sad. It's really sad. Because it didn't have to be this way. There's definitely a sort of path that the CCP could have taken, which did not sort of lead to the tightening, and the sort of horrible things that have happened in Western China. And that's really unfortunate, because a lot of folks, again, 1 billion people live in China, and it's like they're the ones who are dealing with this, with the brunt of the tightening. And I don't think Xi is like, of all the outcomes, I wouldn't say he is the worst possible one, right? There are sort of like, I guess, positive attributes of his reign. He has been able to avert a financial crisis thus far. And I think the sort of like, broadly speaking, growing an economy at 6-7% for another decade, when 1 billion people are benefiting from that is a positive thing for sure. But I think it's a fallacy to think that sort of it needed him and sort of his vision of the role that the state should play in society to deliver that sort of that economic growth and stability. And it's going to be a real mess going forward because, things don't end well when leaders spend more than 10 years in power. The sort of what happens next after Xi is going to be made much more complicated than had China continued in its path that it established after Deng of having semi-regular transitions of power and rule by a elite collective.
Obviously, it's hard to predict what might happen, but how do you see the next transition of power playing out? Do you have any inclination of what might happen, or?
So, I have no idea. That said, it is fun to speculate about. The best piece, which you can link to in your show notes, was written by an Aussie, Richard McGregor, along with Jude Blanchett. They had 4 possible scenarios. First, an orderly transition in 2022, which would be a real dark horse. Second, Xi setting up a retirement plan in 2027 and then retiring in 2032. We could get a leadership challenge or a coup, or he could die or become incapacitated. He's not the most svelte guy in the land. All of those have a fair amount of a lot of branching possibilities that flow out of them, none of which I feel qualified to necessarily comment on. But all I can say is that I find orderly transition 2022 is a vanishing possibility, and given that he has broken the mold and has not groomed a successor and doesn't seem to be particularly interested in doing that, and just given the sort of way the world has going and more people more leaders around the world thinking they can make this work, it makes me very pessimistic that we'll end up having something clean and orderly. And when you're talking about 1/6 of the planet, that's a very dangerous game and situation to be in.
Just quickly and more curious, just from my point of view, with your work, and you've written on Xinjiang as well before, has it what has the blowback been like? Has it been much? What is it? Yeah, what does it all look like from your end? Because I'm just curious for myself, really.
The one thing I'll say is it is now no longer an uncommon thing to be a Westerner talking about Xinjiang. In a way in which it may have been when I sort of started blogging about the topic. And I think that sort of, has probably changed the dynamics, both online and in the real world about sort of speaking out on this issue in particular.
To touch on maybe China's relationship with ASEAN, especially given that there's a common thought maybe within ASEAN that maybe Vietnam might become the next China and the like, what do you think about China's relationship with them and how that goes forward?
Preface, I don't know. That said, what has happened over the course of 2020 with respect to China and Australia is a real canary in a coal mine. We've had a decade plus of China on the one hand, trying to integrate and say, you guys are our favorite, you're in our backyard. And then, this sort of awkwardness with the South China Sea and picking weird fights, which don't, from a sort of economic perspective, seem all that justified with, the Vietnams and Philippines and I guess Malaysia's too of the world. But I feel that narrative was kind of you could kind of put that out of sight and mind because it was this thing happening in an ocean and was not super impactful to anyone's daily life. Fast forward 2020 and you have these pretty aggressive, pretty obnoxious sanctions, which on Australian exports, which were the only justification being we were pissed off that you guys asked for an investigation of what happened, of what the real story with COVID was, and you started talking about Hong Kong and Xinjiang. I would guess that is as glaring a signal as any to the rest of ASEAN and the rest of the world, frankly, of where the line is. And the line, I think, is drawn a lot tighter than a lot of democratic countries are comfortable with and will continue to be comfortable with going forward. So, that means something different if you're talking about Vietnam versus Malaysia, right? or Indonesia. But at the same time, I would imagine it has in a lot of ASEAN capitals made folks a lot less comfortable about their future engagement with the PRC, or with Xi's PRC in particular.
To touch quickly on US-China tech, especially with your role now, I think you're doing much more coverage of it. What's the landscape looking like these days, do you think? And is there anything as well that US can learn from China in their approach to tech and vice versa? Sorry, a big question, but...
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think from a sort of like how much is the US going to crack down on Chinese technology? Like, China's doing the cracking down, man. Like, Biden's such an aftershock thought at this point if you're talking about Chinese tech firms, right? I mean, there was this worry in the investment community. I remember in like 2019, 2020, oh, well, like the US delist Chinese firms because they'll like have these new accounting requirements. No, Beijing's delisting them for them. So, Marco Rubio and like all the right wingers are like super happy that like the Chinese firms are going to be leaving soon, maybe, I guess. Not a development I predicted, but anyways, here we are. The sort of question which drove a lot of Trump era tech policy of like how much is the US going to try to constrain Chinese access to the most advanced technology, like the semiconductor level stuff, like fancy biotech and AI. I think there's a lot more continuity than there is discontinuity when you're looking at what Biden is doing. I think like he, by and large, like accepts the premise that like China's technological rise is a threat to the U.S. from an economic and national security perspective. And, the U.S. has some pretty nifty tools at its disposal to make it a little harder for Chinese firms to get to that technology frontier. And it's deploying them at a rather judicious way, both probably more driven by like human rights-y stuff than, we just want to screw over Chinese firms that are doing well because we don't want to, fight a fair fight with them on the open market. But there have been a ton of entity listings and whatnot over the past 9 months or so, which are, definitely like impacting leading Chinese firms. To your second question of like, what should the U.S. and, we can broaden it out to like, ASEAN, Europe in particular, learn from Chinese firms. I mean, I think like some of the things that are, I spent like a year and a half in the Chinese like tech ecosystem, and it was really interesting because there are lots of aspects of it which were aping the West. Like when I was at Didi, everyone was like, we want to run our company just like Facebook does. So it is really interesting the ways in which this is sort of cyclical, or not. I don't know, it's not cyclical. That's the wrong word. There are ways in which this sort of, there are global feedback loops to these sorts of things. And, the entire Chinese VC ecosystem is largely based off the West. Like the China does have some unique wrinkles, these like government guidance funds, which, were only kicked off a few years ago. And I'm not necessarily sure that the US should be aping, because like just the state is not as good at allocating capital as the private market. And I think, once you start putting hundreds of billions of government money into stuff, especially in a, non-transparent society, you start getting suboptimal things happening with all that cash. The one thing that I think the U.S. is starting to internalize is that, you can sort of subsidize your way into a dominant global position in certain sectors in a way that like, may not be like Pareto optimal if like everyone's playing by the rules, but sort of screws you over if you're the country not playing that game. So, this is like the sort of like straightforward one, which folks are probably familiar with, is like Airbus and Boeing, where both the EU and the US were like, we want to have an airline manufacturer and we will subsidize them, even if it means that even if it means that like we end up kind of losing a bit because we don't want this firm to die. That this has happened. The Chinese government has been pretty strategic at a hand on. Well, they've wasted a ton of money, but they have had some hits. For instance, the solar sector received a fair amount of, not a fair amount, a substantial amount of subsidies, which were allocated in a smart, like relatively like market leaning way, to the point that China makes 90%, 5% of global solar panels. So I think the sort of like, and also the importance of manufacturing as the kind of baseline or through which a lot of sort of like soft expertise gets built up, and sort of being able to like build up through the value chain and not just only doing the like top software stack is something which I think the West is starting to, the rest of the world is starting to internalize, probably for the better. Though, there are dangers in spending government money this less smart ways and distorting it. And, if an industry, I would argue potentially solar is not something where you like for like deep national security reasons, like airplane manufacturers need to have one in your borders. Like, it should be okay if China can make this stuff cheaper and good and, good enough for like the world to buy their solar panels from like very well run Chinese firms.
Yeah. To probably move in a couple of my closing questions. What was your sort of goals for starting the podcast, and what are the biggest things you've learned, I guess, along the way?
Yeah. So I started the podcast when I was in grad school, and I didn't like my assignments, and I was just reading on the side, and I figured, maybe these authors would talk to me. And shockingly, they did. That was really awesome. Everyone should start a podcast. My response rate, even when I literally couldn't say I had one person listening to my show, was like 50 to 60% with folks, who are, maybe not H.R. McMaster or Jake Sullivan, but, have written books and are like actual humans in the world. So I think the most rewarding thing for me has been, not the friends I made along the way, but also the sort of knowledge you get and the amount to which, if you pick a topic and do, I'm like at 175 shows now, a ton of episodes about it, the kind of compounding knowledge that you just absorb by osmosis, because every time I do a show with someone, and it's their book, I read their whole book because I don't want to feel like a jerk. And by reading someone's book and, making like a 3-page outline of all the, interesting quotes and things I want to say, like, you remember that in a way where, sort of half reading something, falling asleep at night, or for class when a test and the test ends and you never think about it again. You don't. So I started this 4 years ago. I knew nothing about China. I had never taken Mandarin before. And ChinaTalk has, held, in the sort of interviews I've done, have like held my hand as I've, learned stuff. And I don't think I'm like the smartest analyst out there, but I, was able to talk to you for 45 minutes off the top of my head with no notes about these developments, I relatively cogently, I hope. So I would like very much attribute that to having this show and building in the discipline of doing these interviews 1 or 2 times a week, and doing the prep and doing the editing. So I sort of like heard it 1 or 2 extra times and let all the sort of knowledge that my guests have sort of sink into my brain. So selfishly, just from a personal development perspective, it's been fantastic. And then I think it's incredibly rewarding knowing that I'm creating something which is, I'm not making like TikTok dance videos. Like, this is I'm putting like very high level, like educational stuff out there to the world. And, 7,000 people download it every week from like everywhere. And that's so gratifying to know that I am like doing something with my life which like people digest and enjoy and like adds to their lives. Lastly, I mean, just from a China specific perspective, like it's an incredibly, understanding China is like one of the most important things that is happening intellectually today. It is a really fraught thing. It is a thing that a lot of people are doing irresponsibly, and is it's kind of upsetting and sad watching sort of like analysis of the country be like simplified and skewed and flattened in a way which is dangerous. I wouldn't necessarily. I don't think like in my interviews I necessarily like give off a real political sort of opinion. When you ask me like, what do you think about Xi in China? Like I was like, oh, I don't know. I'm trying to be objective here. But the one thing I will, very strongly feel is that like doing objective analysis is important, and making sure that like you are not sort of you are sort of starting from the facts and building up, as opposed to like starting with I don't like China, or like, oh, China's great, and like going from there is bad. And I try to do that on my show and just like promote the if there is a worldview, it's that like China, like you can like try to maybe you can never like understand China, but you can like be on a path towards understanding China. The fact that that I can sort of like promote voices that I think are doing that in a responsible and thoughtful way, and be able to give them an audience they might not have otherwise is incredibly rewarding.
Yeah, far out. Jordan, that's a beautiful answer, and I think probably a great way to wrap up. Anything else you want to plug? Where can people find you?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter. Search the ChinaTalk podcast. I'm on Twitter. I also have a newsletter, which I read every week. I translate stuff in Chinese, which is probably more sort of like tech and investor relevant than the hour-long conversation that we had now. But yeah, this was great. I'd love to do it. Love to do it again.
If you enjoyed this podcast episode, be sure to check out the website compoundingpodcast.com. On the website, you'll find every episode complete with transcripts, show notes, and other related resources. Either way, links to all content mentioned will be in the description below. Also be sure to sign up for my weekly newsletter, curated by Kalani, where I share what I've been reading, learning, and watching for that week. Same as the podcast, it's compressed to impress, and I aim for maximum return on your time invested. Sign up at kalanis.substack.com. So that's KALANIS.substack.com. You can also connect with me on Twitter at ScarrettKalani. But until next time, have a good one.